It's the 4th of June, Media Center. Ukraine is in war. I'm Svetlana Nechiporenko. We will talk today about Ukrainian children who've been suffering from the Russian aggression for 11 years. We're talking about this because, according to the UN decision, this day marks the International Day of Protection of Children. Very many kids are now under the Russian occupation. They are growing there, and very few of them are able to leave for the free Ukraine. Today we have with us Olha Kuryshko, who is the chairperson, the representative of President of Ukrainian Autonomous Republic of Crimea, Oleksandra Dvoretska, who is the human rights activist, and she is the manager on political issues of the Bring Kids Back UA initiative, Valentina Potapova from the Center of Civil Education Almenda, Leviza Dzhelal, who is a public figure, and she's also the wife of the former political prisoner Nariman Dzhelal, and we'll have a Ukrainian artist Alevtina Kakhidze with us. So what is the situation with Ukrainian children on the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea now? Hello everyone. This is a very important opportunity to talk about the children and the crimes that the Russian Federation commits against them and the temporarily occupied territories. Of course, I will only provide some general thoughts, and my colleagues will add a lot to what I will have said. Crimea, as far as the occupation is concerned, was a testing ground for some Russian methods that then later were used in the newly occupied territories. We have to keep this in mind. We have to remember that it was Crimea where they have launched one of the direction of the full-scale invasion. They've been deporting children from the territory of Crimea. They've been re-educating them and involving them into paramilitary organizations. This is an important context when we talk about the continuity of crimes perpetrated by the Russian Federation. Sometimes we hear that the war's been in progress for 3 years, including what we hear from some international platforms, but this is not true. The war's been here for 11 years, and the Russian Federation knows very well what they are doing. The crimes that are being perpetrated now began in Crimea since the very first day of the annexation. And you may remember that from 2015 to 2018, they have deported 1,400 children from Crimea who were later adopted or put into boarding houses on the territory of the Russian Federation. What was happening later, we do not know. However, we see that the same processes were happening after 2022, only on a larger scale. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the Russian Federation has been putting even more effort and money into the so-called work with children. They have increased the numbers of kids involved in the youth paramilitary organizations, and it all they are involving children into military components of life. Pupils are being taught how to assemble drones, how to work with different weapons, and many educational activities are connected to military aspects. For instance, some theme parks where kids are being taken around in the models of Russian armored vehicles. They are also involving children into military, paramilitary camps, and we have the instances of deaths. For instance, there was an 11-year-old boy who was in 2023 sent to such a camp in spite of having a heart problem, and he died as a result of conditions there. We're monitoring the situation, and you have to understand the scale of what is happening. What Russia has done in Crimea, they are doing now in the newly occupied territories, so there's a continuity of what they do. The second story is that Crimea is being used now as a certain basis and a certain base to change their identity. What this means when you cannot speak Ukrainian, when you are being made, your parents are being punished when you use some Ukrainian symbols, and of course there are instances of bullying people, young people, because if you are a Ukrainian or a Crimean Tatar in a school, then they join their forces in persecuting you. And what they are doing also, they assemble kids from different parts of the occupied territories, and they involve them into educating them how to correctly love their so-called motherland. In all such cases, they involve veterans of the so-called special military operation who tell those kids how to treat Russia and all this kind of stuff. There are no cultural events in the occupied territories. For instance, if we have different events that we can stage for children, they don't have this. For instance, if there's an event connected to some date, it's by all means military. Some troops come from theatrical and song and dance troops come from the Russian Federation, who stage respective performances. If we think about those 11 years, the worst thing is that kids do not have the future. They have only two choices when they finish their secondary school. It is either to continue their studies in a Russian educational establishment or join the army. They do not have an opportunity to see the world and all this. And of course they are removing everything Ukrainian, thus removing the identity, the Ukrainian identity of those children. For us, as for the state institutions, for people who work with this, the keeping of ties with these children and applying effort to return them to Ukraine and to provide for their integration on the free Ukrainian territory is very important, including the fact that then they may received documents issued by Ukraine. I think I will stop at this. Thank you. I will now pay attention to the legal aspect of this issue. Oleksandra, could you please tell us about the major problems that Ukrainian human rights activists see on the occupied territories? Yes, we have assembled on the said occasion in 2021. The Ukrainian parliament has also proclaimed this day the day of memory of children who have died as a result of the Russian aggression, and we now have 631 cases of deaths of children, and this is only when we can find this out, because we still do not have the access to the occupied territories. Like, for instance, we cannot establish how many children were killed in Mariupol, for instance. We'll talk about also 1,975 children who were wounded, different wounds. Some of them lost their legs or arms. They have lost the opportunity to continue their life in a fully fledged way as a result of Russian drone and missile attacks. We're also talking about children who went missing on the temporarily occupied territories, and there's a horrible crime, the deportation and forcible relocation of children. Olga had said something about this, but I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that Crimea has become the hub of for deported children. For instance, in 2022, when the Russians have occupied very quickly Kherson region, it was Crimea that they used as a way to transport children further into the proper Russian territory. When we talk about deportation, we talk about relocation of children to other countries, to Russia or Belarus. When we're talking about forcible relocation, this is, of course, forcible, but this is within the occupied territories. For instance, children from Mariupol being transported to Donetsk and bring us back UA initiative. The initiative launched by the President of Ukraine was a response to what the Russians do. First of all, we are, of course, looking for the children and verifying the information that we get. The second stage is the organization of their being brought back. 1,145 children were able to bring back, but more than 19,000 our children are still either in Russia or in temporarily occupied territories. Then we are working with investigators, because this is about war crimes. Of course, we work with children in a way that is kid-friendly. We involved legal workers and representatives. The stories that they tell are really horrifying. The system of militarization is absolutely horrifying. Everyone tells about not being allowed to speak Ukrainian, about their involvement in propaganda events, about being punished for when they refuse to take this, and they are being made to do quite a lot in front of many people and in front of the entire school. Sometimes we may even mock them for instance, sitting children in the models of the tanks and all this, but they have actually launched the network of organizations that makes children the so-called little eagles of Russia when they are being involved since 3 years of age. The so-called youth army or young army, Yunarmia, is being financed by billions of rubles from the Russian state budget, and those kids are regarded as a mobilization resource. After graduating from the school, you can very easily join the army, while the graduation or while the joining exams for universities are very hard. So actually this is the only choice that they leave for children in the occupied territories, where they have to go to the army. They have already tested this system in Sevastopol or in Donetsk, and then school children from Sevastopol go to Melitopol, for instance, to teach the Ukrainian children. At the moment, they have the all-Russian stage of the work Zarnitsa, of the I am from Crimea, and I remember how we did this in the Soviet times. However, today, the Zarnitsa game is the preparation for the new war. There are medics, there's the political worker, there's the drone operator within every team that takes part in Zarnitsa game. This is how this game looks. Now you can see this in Mariupol, in Simferopol, in Zaporizhia region. This entire system is being led from and managed from the Kremlin. It's being financed from the state budget. They involved kids from the very early age. They select leaders who will involve other people, other kids. And we see stories like, for instance, in Zhankoye, when a child who joined the Yun army in 2017 has died on the front line in 2022. This is how Russia wants to make war against Ukraine with the hands of Ukrainian children, not with their own. We have issued the report last year, our initiative, about all this, and we also suggested the list of people who are being involved in the militarization of Ukrainian children on the occupied territories and in erasing their identity. We call upon everyone internationally to pay attention to this and say that the attack against young children's identity is no better than the attack by Russian missiles against Ukrainian cities. Thank you, Oleksandra. And then we'll talk about education programs, how the Russian Federation instills the Russian ideology, militarized imperial ideology, in our children, and what are the tools that they use starting from kindergarten and ending with the universities. Valentina, thank you for the event that you're holding, because really we today are within a different kind of war. If we think about the history, the last World War was in 20th century, and this was the war of civilization, which can be called an industrial civilization. The 21st century is marked with information civilization. So when we talk about this war, we have to understand that the analogies that we can use do not work. This is a different kind of war. It is very, and the Russian Federation has understood very well that this is a different kind of war. They started to prepare for this war far in advance. I remember how the information space in Crimea has changed after the Kharkiv agreements. I worked at the university then, and there were conferences organized about the Russian world perspectives, and there was a branch of the Moscow University in Sevastopol. The day of to mark the birthday anniversary of Pushkin was actually the All Crimean Day, and so on and so forth. More than that, the Russian Federation started to prepare the ideological platform for this war. And this platform has got the name Russian World. Here we shall remember Dugin and the company. Olha has said that Crimea has become a testing ground for working out the tools. This is really so, because in 2022, first of all, we have seen that they are using almost everything that was developed and tested in Crimea. And then we understood that Crimea, the political indoctrination in Crimea has provided the Russian Federation with an opportunity to work on their mistakes, to correct their mistakes, and work out an improved, perfected system. When I was analyzing the textbooks that were seized after the deoccupation of the Kharkiv region, 23 textbooks starting from the ABC book and finishing with the Russian literature textbook, I had to copy the quotes and by hand, and my hands got tired. So I thought that maybe I will do this by copy-pasting from the sites, because it turned out that I could not copy-paste because the texts were already changed, although the authors remain the same. For instance, Ukraine has vanished from the textbooks on the world history. There was no Ukraine there, and I was surprised at first. How can they be? Because they, for instance, have you are waging the war against Ukraine, but no, they say that they are waging war on their own territory. They have already introduced the idea into their textbooks that there's no Ukraine as such. Even in the textbook for 8th grade, when there's a topic of the so-called reunification of Ukraine with Russia during the Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising. In the textbook issued in 2012, they said that the Ukrainian people wanted to join Russia, but in today's textbook they already say Ukrainian population. So the people is going away, being replaced by population. This is how they change the political identity of children, and everything that the Russian Federation does is the formation of some political consciousness. 7th grade, children are being told about who the Tsar is and who the boyars are, who the peasants are, and so on, some social strata. So the Tsar is a person whose function, according to the textbook, is a person who has to take care about the people, who has to pray in favor of the people. But even if something bad is happening, and I'm quoting now, it is not the fault of the Tsar, it is the fault of the boyars who have wrongly informed the Tsar. And then I found out that this was about the Tsar, who was Ivan the Terrible. So I understood that it was Ivan the Terrible who was taking care of the people from morning, from dusk till dawn, and from dawn till dusk. And then, of course, they are forming their loyalty to strong power, and this is being done starting with such tales about the Tsar. And then there were some textbooks where Vladimir Putin appears, so no comment here, because first we teach people that Tsar is someone who takes care of the people, and then in grade 10 or 11 we tell kids that we cannot change the president, because the president is the person who takes care of the people. And then there were practical tasks for senior students, school students, where they had to write projects, where they had to study the question why sometimes putting democratic principles on hold is good for the development of the society. And this, of course, it concerned the conflict between the president and the parliament in Russia. And now they are showing a lot of obligatory films to the people and to the pupils, to the children, and most of these films are Soviet-era films, like The Father of a Soldier, Officers, which are very professionally well done. But there are also some films after 2022. The film Passenger, for instance, tells us about a boy who loved Pushkin, Dostoevsky, and then Ukraine came and forbade him to read Pushkin and Dostoevsky. And then Ukrainian tanks came, and he came to meet the tanks with a portrait of Pushkin in order to stop the Ukrainian tanks with Pushkin's world. So this is not about the tank, it is about the change of political consciousness, and over the 11 years they have done this, regrettably. To my great regret, the Convention of Children's Rights and Human Rights, which appeared after the Second World War, this was a different kind of war. The cultural genocide that the Russians are doing, everything that they do with the change of consciousness and identity, it does not give us the opportunity to hold them responsible directly. So our task is not only to protect those children, but to change the approaches and tell the world as much as we can about what's happening. Because if the world think about the war that can start global war or local war will be different in their countries. No, this will be the same kind of war where the major target of the aggressor will be kids and the change of their consciousness. Apart from the change of consciousness and the change of identity, the Russian Federation takes away from children their parents by arresting them, by keeping them imprisoned. And we talk here about Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. Leviza, you are the wife of the former political prisoner. It is very good that your children are now with your husband, but they had a very grave period when their dad was not with them. How does this affect the psychological state of children? I will today talk not only as the wife of the former political prisoner, but also the mother of 4 kids who had to live for years without their father as a result of the oppressions that the Russians are perpetrating in the occupied Crimea. In Crimea, not only activists, journalists, or Majlis representatives are being prosecuted, they are pressurizing the families, especially kids. The number of adolescents who have been left without their fathers is growing, and at the moment this is 253 kids, including 51 who are ill, and 4 of them are kids with disabilities. The topic of political prisoners, children, is not just a political issue. This is a deep humanitarian crisis. I would like to point out the results, the after effects. This is not an abstract event, the arrest of their parents. As in our case, this usually happens very early in the morning when the entire family is asleep and kids are being woken up by a very loud knocking on the door, and usually there are 20 armed persons taking part in the arrest. Sometimes they break the windows and the shards fall on the kid who sleeps next to the window. And you know, this is a chronicle, regular stress in which those children are. And those children become totally afraid of any loud sounds, including the ringing the bell, the doorbell, and they have nightmares. Of course, this all has their names in psychology and psychiatry, but for us this is the pain of our children with which we live every day. Luckily for us, our family is reunited, but at the moment, a great lot of families are in this condition that we used to be. And this, of course, falls on the shoulders of mothers and wives who not only fight for the rescue of their husbands, but also for the fate of their children. There are social after-effects, of course, when they face bullying in their kindergartens, schools, not only from their classmates, but also from adults, when they are being told that their fathers are terrorists, and because allegedly they are in prison, they are criminals. They do not deserve this, of course. Because of the political repression, the family does not only lose their father, they lose the main provider. And the problem of poverty is another huge problem, because you do not only have to buy food, clothes, and pay communal expenses, but you have also to sustain legal expenses, pay the lawyer, go to the court, and send something to your husband in the prison. This all is being done by the wives, and of course the opportunities for children's development are limited. They cannot go anywhere, they cannot have a proper vacation. Our story is just one of those numerous stories. I would like to remember the family of Ruslan Suleimanov. He was arrested, and the family was actually paralyzed by the pressure, and their small son, little son, Musa, has disappeared. These are the families where the children have lost their childhood. This is not statistics. These are broken fates of those children. So I would like to say something about the role of the civil society. I think that it is the nature of the Crimean Tatar community to come together around different problems. We have now local groups to help such children, like Rimbalar, Crimean Childhood. There are also individuals who help such children, and due to these initiatives, those children can obtain psychological and humanitarian aid. We organize camps and circles where children start to believe in themselves. However, international advocacy is very important. We need the entire world to know about such people and keep them in the focus. Thank you for inviting me today and raising this issue. It is very important. I appeal to everyone who is concerned. You cannot abandon these children. Of course, those families are strong, but they are not omnipotent. They do need the solidarity of the Ukrainian society, of Crimean Tatar diasporas, of the international community. And these kids are the first victims of political violence. They have not chosen such childhood for themselves. Any questions from the journalists? If you do not have questions, I have one. Today we have heard more than once that Crimea has become a testing ground for the Russian Federation, where the change of identity and the intrusion into Ukrainian children's consciousness is concerned, and then they were spreading this practice in the newly occupied territories, and also there was a talk about that Russia has corrected some mistakes. What was changed starting from 2022 in the militarization of this education system, of the labor system of our children? What has changed? First of all, I'd like to say that the Russian Federation has made conclusions about the fact that Ukrainians continue to keep contact, to be in contact with Ukraine. There was a checkpoint system where almost 1 million people, despite all the propaganda and everything, were coming from the occupied territory to the free territory and vice versa. People were coming to the free territory to draw some documents, to get Ukrainian passports, and I think that this was one of the conclusions that the Russians have made, to cut the contacts as soon as possible. Earlier, the young people could go to the free Ukraine and join the universities there. At the moment, their children cannot leave the occupied territory, even if they are 16 or 17, but when they become of age, of legal age, they start to get new barriers on their way. They have also simplified the process of issuing Russian citizenship, and also they do not need the permit from parents or legal guardians. In Russia now, they can bestow Russian citizenship on the deported children at the will of a director of some detention center who only yesterday saw those kids for the first time. Then there's information blockade. In Crimea, the first thing they did, or one of the first things, was the expulsion of Ukrainian channels from the air. And we see now that in the newly occupied territories, they were targeting people who could provide alternative information, and we now see that not only children but the adult population is deprived of access to Ukrainian information. There are some things that are happening gradually, and sometimes you cannot foresee the after effects. The full-scale invasion has shown some of the results of the policy introduced by the Russian Federation during the 8 years before this stage of war. First of all, they put a great emphasis on cultural and religious components and on their impact on the youth. I think that one of the best visual proofs of this is the complex of New Kherson in the occupied Crimea. There's a huge building there in the style of Russian Empire. Unbelievably great building, large building, and it has several functions. First of all, there's a Russian Orthodox Church there. They have some religious events there. Then there's a cultural component. They have the hall where they display the artifacts they've stolen from Zaporizhia and Kherson region, and they sort of stage an exhibition there which tells us about the alleged Russian history of those lands. And the third component are events with children. They stage different events there, and all this is connected one to another. What they do with children is necessarily accompanied with the visit to the exhibition, and then they also say that if you have not been baptized, you may do this in the church. And what we're talking about with our international partners, the Russians are looking constantly for legitimization of their presence in the occupied territories, but they actually conduct quite a lot of events in their foreign Russian houses where they involve children who are formally of the citizens of Russian Federation, although they in fact are descendants of those. And what they are now doing with Artek Pioneer Camp, children's camp, they bring their people from and children from foreign countries who are descendants of Russian emigres. So they show that allegedly the unification, the bringing together of those people is a good thing, and they necessarily have military representatives during those events in Artek. To sum up, I'd quote the results of the monitoring of public organizations. The number of children who are involved in the young army has grown manifold, so they do everything in order to influence children in different ways. I'd like to add that I see the difference in the strengthening of repressions. There were no repressions in Crimea. Used to be no repressions in Crimea when someone refused to join the young army. However, in the newly occupied territories, they are launching repressions against such people. Yesterday, we got the information from the newly occupied territory when a child refused to go to the military and patriotic camp, but the parents of this child were invited to a conversation, and then they were fired from their jobs. In Crimea, they have not taken mobile phones from children in order to see whether they use some Ukrainian sources, but this is happening in the newly occupied territories, and there were no prisons or cellars for the teachers who were doing something wrong from the Russian point of view, but they are doing this in the newly occupied territories, and this pertains also to the parents of children. Now, when we talk to teachers who provide education to children in the temporarily occupied territories, I can tell you that in 2023, we had 53,000 kids who were learning online. Last year, we had 45,000 children who learned online, and now we had only 42,000 online pupils. When we talk to teachers who provide this service to our children, they say that the intimidation has grown to such an extent that parents say, sorry, we cannot risk our children. Both before 2022 and after 2022, we lived in Crimea, and the political repressions have become more severe. Officially, we know that there's something like 318 political prisoners. According to our unofficial data, every week they take away 2 people on average, and these are people about whom we do not know. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for raising such an important issue. I do hope that the world will take this into account and will understand that peace negotiations is okay, but Russia is preparing for a large-scale war. We were talking about Ukrainian children who've been suffering for 11 years under the Russian occupation. Thank you very much. We're working out on our schedule. Thank you for staying with Media Center Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.